Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final Capital concert of the 24-25 season. It's called Fantastique, and of course, it alludes to the second half of the program, which features the epic Symphonie Fantastique by Hector Berlioz. So we'll talk about that in a bit here. First half of the concert will be dedicated to two works by Andy Akiho. Andy, for those of you who are local to Colombia, uh, you might have heard some of his music already this season over at the University of South Carolina School of Music. Just a few weeks ago, they premiered a piece of his, the USC Wind Ensemble played a new piece of his as well. He's considered one of the leading composers of his generation, but he has a strong local ties. He grew up here in Colombia, and as a matter of fact, he actually played in our youth orchestra program when he was pre-college, and then he graduated from the University of South Carolina with his undergrad. And so he's one of the great list of alums from the School of Music who is doing great things out in the world. And of course, this is before my time here, but while he was a student at USC, he actually subbed in our orchestra in the percussion section. So we have a long connection with Andy and with his music. What's interesting is I first came across his music um, without realizing that he has such a strong Colombia and South Carolina ties. I came across the album of his chamber music that featured um, like many of the tracks. There's a multi-movement suite that refers to his sense of synesthesia. So he's one of those people who, again, I'm colorblind, as some of you know. So I don't really understand this, but there are people who, when they hear a certain sound, they associate that sound or pitch in some instance with a particular color. So all the movements are in different or are titled after different colors. But what interested me was because many of those movements have the names of the colors are in Japanese. So I ended up programming a chamber piece of his called Kiro. Kiro is yellow in Japanese. And I did that several years ago with another orchestra. And then I, started kind of following his other compositions. And during the course of that process, then I realized reading his bio that he said he grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, and went to USC. So then sort of began this process, this kind of process of programming some of his orchestral works here with SC Phil. We did a piece called Tarnish Mirrors in 2016, which is a purely orchestral work. And then he was here in 2017 because just yesterday, actually, um, you know how you go on Facebook and it said 8 years ago, 10 years ago today, and there's a photo. And I realized yesterday said 8 years ago, and there was a selfie with Andy and Chris Lee, who is our principal percussionist and who was very much influential on Andy's musical training, especially when it comes to steel pan playing. And so in 2017, Andy came and performed one of his steel pan concertos, the new one at the time. And then this year, at this weekend's concerts, we are presenting two works by Andy. He will be the feature soloist in the very first piece, which is called Fantasy for Steel Pan and Orchestra. And that is I think that is his first orchestral piece that he composed. I think he was a student at Yale at the time. It dates from 2010, I believe. And then we'll follow that up with sort of the regional premiere of his new cello concerto, which is subtitled Nisei. Nisei means second generation in Japanese. And he wrote this piece for cellist Jeff Zeigler. Jeff is a multifaceted, amazing cellist. Was member of the Kronos Quartet at one time as well. But Andy wrote this piece for Jeff and a consortium of, I believe, five different orchestras, of which we are very proud to be one of them. So Jeff will be in town with us performing this music as well. Andy will be participating with me in a few of the pre-concert talks before the concert, and I'm planning to have Andy speak a little bit about his music at the beginning of the concert before we play his music on Saturday night as well. So, and there's also, if you follow our social, South Carolina Philharmonic's social channels, there's a wonderful interview that was done by Jeffrey Day that was just published this week. So I encourage you to kind of go there, kind of learn from in Andy's own words, really, his inspirations and background for some of the pieces you'll be hearing with us on Saturday. That brings us to the second half, as I mentioned, is the Symphony Fantastique by Berlioz. And, it's interesting because, Berlioz very much idolized as a young composer. He idolized Beethoven. Berlioz was born in 1803. So, and Beethoven died in 1827. So, I think and when you hear this piece, and just a few years, this piece was first performed in 1830, so just 3 years after Beethoven's death. And in a way, I mean, we consider Beethoven. We did the Eroica Symphony last month, which was revolutionary when Beethoven wrote it. USC Symphony just did Beethoven's Ninth, which is also very revolutionary in its own way. And a few years later, to have this symphony, which then is revolutionary in a completely different way as well. It's kind of the first part of the 19th century as far as the musical landscape, especially with composers. It's incredible to see like how much was happening and how much of that music we still perform today, and it still entertains us, but also like challenges all the performers because of the complexity of the writing, just the sheer challenge for any ensemble, regardless of like this piece. Most of the musicians have played this piece multiple times probably, but it's never easy. It's never walk in the park because of the sheer drama and technical demands, and also the length, which basically lasts almost basically about 50 minutes long in five movements. And it is written for a fairly large orchestra. Berlioz uses two harps in this piece, but the two harps are only used in the second movement out of five movements. So that's interesting. Two tubas. You'll see us using two tubas in the orchestra, full brass section. You'll see in the woodwinds, he actually wrote not for two bassoons, but for four bassoons, even though most of the time they're doubling over two parts. So there are two bassoonists playing each of the parts, but he specifically wanted four bassoons. To the point where he's going through painstakingly in the score where he just wanted the two traditional two bassoonists, and other spots where he wanted them doubled, played by four bassoonists. Two sets of timpanis you will see on the stage, along with a huge battery of percussion instruments as well. There are some interesting aspects musically as well. beginning of the third movement, which is essentially serves as the slow movement of this five movement symphony. It opens with this duet between English horn, who is on the stage in her regular spot in the woodwind section, and oboe. And at first, when you hear the oboe solo, you might be wondering where is that coming from. He wanted the oboist off stage in the distance to create this sense of he. This is kind of alluding to two. Berlioz is out in the field and out in the meadows, and he's hearing two shepherds sort of calling each other musically. So the one is in far distance, that's represented by the oboe and English horn, and that represents the shepherd who is nearby, close to Berlioz. So you have that kind of effect as well. There are a few other effects where Berlioz was among the first one, if not the first, to utilize effects. Some of the effects, like on the string instruments, for instance, there's a section where in the last movement, there's a moment that sounds like chattering of teeth coming from a strange sound coming from the string section, and it's because they're striking their strings not with the normal hair side of the bow, but they flip it over and they're instructed to basically strike it with the wood side of the bow, which creates such a very strange and interesting sound. It's a technique that's now used. Andy uses it in the cello concerto as well at one point, but Berlioz was sort of groundbreaking in the use of this col manual with wood is the actual translation effect on the string instruments. Much have been written about the origin of this piece and sort of the story behind it. So I'm sure some of you are already familiar with this, but it's in a way it's a very much an autobiographical piece of music. And the full title is Symphonie Fantastique, which basically means fantastic symphony. And there's a subtitle. It says it means episode in the life of an artist in five parts. So here, the artist, you realize that he's talking about himself. It's based on his recent experience. And so what happened was, as a young man, Berlioz was very much, I think he loved literature, but especially English literature, even though he was not my understanding is that he read them in French translations because he was not well versed in English language, but for instance, I mean, if you look at his catalog of works, you'll notice pieces like this huge. He called it dramatic symphony, but it's based on Romeo and Juliet. There's a piece called King Lear Overture, Beatrice and Benedict. A lot of these works based on Shakespearean works. And so I think he was a huge fan of Shakespeare and in theater, English theater in general. So in 1827, when he was still 23 years old, he attended a performance of Hamlet that was done by a touring company from England. And he during the course of the play he found himself sort of wildly struck in love with this Irish actress by the name of Harriet Smithson, who was playing the role of Ophelia for that production. And he just became so infatuated with this actress Harriet Smithson, and basically became obsessed in a way. And there's a story of how then he read in the tabloids or something that she was supposedly having an affair with her manager or the company touring manager or something like this. And he became like all jealous and all of these things. And so then he decides that he that sort of became an inspiration. So whatever this tumultuous infatuation that he was feeling towards Harriet Smithson became the inspiration for this the symphony for Symphony Fantastique. So that's what he did. Um, in the original performance of the symphony, he provided a very detailed program notes for the whole symphony, going through each of the five movements and sort of describing what is happening to this artist himself through through the course of the five movements. Symphony, it's pretty wild ride. You hear, and it also just to pause for a sec, this was rather unusual at the time. Of course, you had already, many operas, oratorios, music with words and text, libretto, and so on, that were obviously written before this, that is narrative in nature, and they have a particular scenario, obviously, because of the text. And so that was nothing unusual. It was rather unusual for especially a completely instrumental work, piece of music like this symphony, to have such a sort of extra musical, we call this program, reference, and specifically mentioned for the audience or any performer or audience by the composer themselves. There's a little bit of that in the Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, but it's very generic. You get a sense of sort of the listener is basically left on their own devices to kind of make kind of understand the references or imagine the references based on the title of the movements, right? So if there's a storm and you hear the rolling of the timpani, you start to think, oh, that must be the thunder. So the peasants, celebrating harvest, or something like that. You kind of get the sense based on the character of the music that's being played. Nothing to the point where what Berlioz did in this instance, where it's very much specific, and to the point where he actually, in the first movement, it's also a little bit unusual, also in a sense that there is a slow introduction, and he calls this daydream. The first movement is in two parts: the slow introduction, which he called daydreams, and the main allegro, the fast part of the movement, which he called passion. So this is sort of retelling of the artist falling in love with this objective affection. At the very beginnings, and the unusual thing is that the slow introduction takes almost 5 minutes before we get to the allegro proper part of the first movement. So when we think about typical, it is, as far as slow introduction in a symphony goes, it's just fairly extensive. So it's like it has its own character, its own like meaning in the first 5 minutes. And when the allegro part starts, the first violins and the flute will together play this theme. Um, this theme he called fixed idea or idea fix. And it's similar idea basically as um, Star Wars, for instance. When you watch all the Star Wars films, John Williams has basically a leitmotif, which was an idea that was created by Wagner, really, in his operas in the 19th century. But when you see Darth Vader on the screen, you are going to hear the Imperial March on the screen. When you hear, the Yoda has his theme, all of these things, like the sort of the Jedi theme, all of these ideas. So when you see a particular character on the screen, you hear a specifically associated musical theme with that particular character or the concept. And so something like this basically Berlioz is doing here, but he uses a one particular theme and he called it fixed idea or idea fixed. as I mentioned, first play by the first violins and the flute at the beginning of the fast section of the first movement. And that represents his beloved. And the way that he marked sort of the phrasing and how he wants the inflection of this theme, which if you just play it straight, it's a conventional theme. But the way he adds all this rise and fall and inflection points, the accents and so on, is a very much makes it a gives it a completely different character. It's almost as though to sort of also not just the representation of, in this case, the artist's beloved, the object of his affection, but also kind of also at the same time describing sort of the artist's feeling. This almost like, this it's very almost like a stormy kind of the wild kind of feeling that the artist must be feeling at this point. As a matter of fact, underneath that theme, when it's first presented, the rest of the strings are providing essentially, it's almost like a heartbeat. You hear a lot of this strings playing, and sometimes the heartbeat is calm. Sometimes the heartbeat gets rather unsteady or just almost out of control because the heart is it's like beating wildly. So you will hear that theme. What he does through the rest of the symphony is that he then will refer back to the theme in many different ways. Second movement is a ballroom scene. So it's called a ball, and it's this starts out with this. It's almost the scene is almost as though the artist and you, the listeners, are basically kind of you're approaching the dance hall, and maybe you start to hear sort of the you see the swirling couples in the distance, almost not very clear, maybe just in the distance, and you hear the music that just starts out kind of suggesting a waltz that starts out very soft and then eventually just gets loud. It's almost as though you're finally opening the door or maybe going through the curtain or something into a the the ballroom where there's this such festive party with everybody, all these people waltzing is happening in front of your eyes. So such a cool effect at the beginning where just kind of the Berlioz takes you to that moment. But as the artist finds himself at this ballroom, he can't help but his mind is still with thinking about Harriet in this case, but speaking about thinking about the objective is affection. So you will see all of a sudden in the middle of the waltz, you start to hear sort of in the distance, you hear the idea fix, the fixed idea that theme music for his objective, his affection, which is played by the woodwinds, lute and oboe. But the Berlioz marks them to play this idea even softer than what's happening in the strings, which is the strings are continuing on with this kind of depicting like the swirling waltz action of the people right in front of the artist. So he's still in the middle of the dance floor, but then he's like maybe he's imagining like he sees her in amongst the crowd, but in the distance. But then there are people swirling around, so he can't quite get a clear glimpse of her. So there's like all of these interesting references using the fixed idea. Uh, in the the most famous use of the fixed idea comes in the final movement, where even Berlioz himself says that the sort of the this beautiful idealized version of the theme is now replaced by this grotesque, shrill, kind of crass uh, presentation of it. And so you will hear that moment. That's a famous excerpt for E flat clarinet, which is smaller than the regular clarinet, and it tends to have well, the it can play very high and shrill, but it just have a very um, it doesn't have the kind of the tone color that E flat clarinet produces. Tends to have a more direct and more shrill, penetrating, like a piercing quality than the regular clarinet, for sure. So he kind of uses that to interesting effect. He uses Dies Irae theme, which is the famous Gregorian chant, Day of Wrath, which composers like Rachmaninoff, also Liszt, Franz Liszt as well, uh, loved using. Uh, Berlioz incorporates the Dies Irae theme, which is first played by the bassoons and the low brass. Um, and you will hear sort of how that theme gets developed in conjunction with the Idir fix, but the grotesque version of it towards the end of the final movement into the conclusion of the symphony. Of course, the fifth movement is called Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. So it gets a very different kind of feeling. There's a famous March to the Scaffold movement, which is fourth movement that precedes Dreams of Witch's Sabbath. Um, so it's such a vivid musical journey in a way. Interesting thing is that for the very first performance, he provided a very lengthy, detailed program. And there was a fellow composer, Robert Schumann, who was also a known music critic. He was a very well respected critic and a writer about music. And Schumann actually heard this piece, attended a concert, read the huge program, and he suggested that perhaps Berlioz um, kind of trim it down a bit to make it maybe not as specific, sort of less play by play and more sort of a general depiction for each movement, because he felt that maybe perhaps then the listener would, wouldn't be able to use their own imagination, sort of create their own story as they listen to each of the movements. So Berlioz kind of took heed to that criticism or the advice, and in the later published score, he actually kind of then trimmed it down. And so you kind of see both versions of this in different program notes. So whether you know what's happening almost play by play in each of the movement, or if you just have a general idea of what is happening, either way, I think it's it does stir imagination, and it is such a you know brilliantly brilliantly orchestrated work and with full of drama. Um, Certainly does get loud towards the end of this. So hope you enjoyed it. This is really a great way to close out our 60th anniversary season. And I'd like to thank you for being part of our celebration season, and hope you enjoyed the concert.